Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. When we examine the tapestry of mid-20th century America, certain figures emerge not just as cultural touchstones, but as revolutionary forces who fundamentally altered our national consciousness. In the decades following World War II, as prosperity grew and old barriers began to fall, an extraordinary generation of Jewish Americans seized their moment with a bold, unapologetic genius that would redefine everything from music to comedy, from feminism to literature. My guest today, David Denby, has crafted what has been called an exuberant, beautiful, wise celebration of American Jewish life in the 20th century. In his new book, Eminent Jews, Denby brings a critical eye on four remarkable lives: Leonard Bernstein, whose conducting style broke every convention; Mel Brooks, who transformed trauma into boundary-shattering comedy; Betty Friedan, whose feminist vision upended American domestic life; and Norman Mailer, whose literary aggression challenged every sacred cow. What makes this work so timely now is not just Denby's masterful portraits, but his exploration of a pivotal historical moment when these four figures, all born within 8 years of each other, wielded their Jewish heritage as a creative weapon, electrified by American freedom in ways their inner immigrant parents could never have imagined. David Denby has been a cultural force himself for decades, first as film critic to New York Magazine for 20 years, then at The New Yorker, where he's now a staff writer. His previous books include Snark, Great Books, Lit Up, and American Sucker, explorations of education, film, and American culture. At a time when anti-Semitism is once again surging in America, when the diaspora is facing hard questions, this conversation couldn't be more essential. It is my pleasure to welcome David Denby here to talk about his new book, Eminent Jews. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, God, I could open on Broadway with that introduction. Thank you. I mean, you're the first person who's actually understood what the book was about. So
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
thanks, Jeff.
Well, you're welcome. Talk a little bit about the state of American Jews, the state of American Jewishness in the post-World War II period.
Well, a lot of wonderful things were happening. Obviously, the Jews were doing well. Except if you were Jewish, you weren't supposed to say so. Shush! Don't, poke the bear. Simon Kuznets, the Nobel Prize winner in the middle 50s, did bring out a paper talking about levels of Jewish income going by ethnic groups. But it wasn't until the late 90s that scholars really got into it and stopped being afraid of bringing out what was a very clear success. I mean, the Jewish working class had largely disappeared by 1950. It had become a middle and upper middle and a lot higher professional class, businessmen of all kinds, entertainment. Obviously, that had been there for a long time. Broadcasting, uh, the intellectual professions, universities, teaching at all levels, and many other things. So there was that sense of, okay, we're not here on sufferance as Jews had been in, say, Spain or 15th century or France in the 19th century. We're here and we belong here. And the most moving thing, Jeff, it brings tears to my eyes every time I read it, is the letter that George Washington wrote to the Newport congregation after his presidential election and thanking them for their support. He says, in effect, you are not here on sufferance. You're here as citizens. Every man under his own fig tree should be content. I mean, and God, they wrote well, those founding fathers. I don't care if Hamilton wrote it for him. It's still very, very moving. So, all right, so there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s, God knows, and the moguls, the movie moguls in the 30s, kept Jews out of the movies and wouldn't allow any criticism of Germany until 1939. Confessions of a Nazi Spy, Warner Brothers. Finally, it started to break free. But after the war, there was a reduced anti-Semitism, horror over what later became called the Holocaust, and we didn't call it that in the 50s and early 60s. just a sense of prosperity and belonging. All those Catskill comics, not just Mel, but in fact, but so many of them, Danny Kaye and so on, who had been up there in the mountains, 100 miles northwest of New York, wound up on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Ed Sullivan Show was the national clearinghouse for great new entertainment. Elvis, the Beatles, every Sunday night for 23 years, and there they were doing their Yiddish inflected comedy. So there was a whole number of markers that made these people feel safer than they had ever. I'll tell you two quick stories, very quick. Mel Brooks is walking across 57th Street near Carnegie Hall. It's about 1952. He's like 26. He's working for Sid Caesar, the great TV show, Your Show of Shows, live TV every Saturday night, 90 minutes of just hair-raising difficulty, often brilliant. Anyway, he's working with two colleagues from the show. They're all sketch writers, and the guy on his and three nuns are coming across 57th Street, and the guy on Mel's left says, "No, Mel, no. What are you talking about?" And the guy on his right, who was Neil Simon, actually later became famous playwright, said, "What? Get hold of yourself. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing." Mel said, "Nothing." The nuns come up close, and he leaps out at them and he says, "Take off those costumes. The nun sketch is out." I said to him, "Mel, how did they respond?" He said, "They hit the ground." Okay? Anecdote number two. Leonard Bernstein is conducting the Vienna Philharmonic, the great Vienna Philharmonic in Vienna in 1972, and he's struggling with them over Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Now, two relevant pieces of backstory here. Mahler had been conductor of the Philharmonic and the State Opera from 1897 to 1907. He had conducted some of his own symphonies with them during the Nazi period. From 1938 to 45, of course, he was banned completely, and some of the symphonies were played afterwards, but not the later ones. And Bernstein was shocked that they were the great climax in the first movement of the Fifth Symphony. They were holding back. They were holding back from their own music, and he was hearing grumblings from the rank, Schweizermusik, which I don't think I have to translate, and words like that. And this was their own music, and he, a Jew from Boston, suburban Boston, and an American, was going to teach them their own music, and he did, and had an extraordinary effect on musical culture. But this was an American Jew who taught them their own music, and I think it changed. He felt that by denying Mahler, they were denying part of themselves. Mahler is very complex, very tormented, exultant 1 minute, pathetic the next minute, sarcasm, parody. The whole 20th century is in there. He died in 1911. Anyway, by getting the Vienna Philharmonic and other orchestras in Europe to play Mahler with real passion, he was bringing out some part of themselves that had been suppressed during the Nazi period. So, okay, I could go on with the other two, but my point is not that you have to talk tough, with Gentiles in order to be a virtuous Jew. Certainly not. My point is they didn't expect to be punished. They did not expect to be punished for these outrages. They felt safe. And I think that was new. I mean, of course, there was outrageous vaudeville and everything, but we're talking about something a little different in tone. I'm here. You tried to kill us all. We have a great contribution to make. You failed. We're still here. I mean, Mel is the only one who would put it in such blunt terms. But I think all four of them were saying that.
With respect to that transformation, the transformation out of the working class to the middle class, this transformation of feeling safe in the post-war period, to what extent was this organic? Did it just happen? Was there leadership? Were there ideas out there in the culture that led to this? Talk about that.
Well, I think, first of all, the Jewish defense organizations like the Anti-Defamation League kept bringing up anti-Semitism uh, during the war, after the war, and often quite successfully. And I think people were truly shocked by the degree of the slaughter. It's a very tough subject for Jews themselves because during the war itself, nobody said much. The literary critic Alfred Kazin, in his autobiographies, and particularly the last one, New York Jew, said that he knew by early 1942 um, that at least 2 million Jews had been slaughtered. And it didn't seem to affect people emotionally. I think, including fellow Jews in New York, it was very hard to take in. And so then when the consciousness did hit, it created an enormous anger and an enormous anguish among Jews and a determination never again. And my four were not, except for Leonard, were not interested in Israel. Lenny, of course, was and went there 47, 48. During the War of Independence. He was riding around in trucks with the Israel Philharmonic musicians playing very close to where battles had taken place. I mean, he claims they could hear sometimes cannon in the distance. They gave 40 concerts in 60 days, which seems impossible. But and he kept going back there, and he conducted the Israel Philharmonic, in Vienna and Berlin, putting it to them. Anyway, the others were not particularly interested in Israel, but I think the fact that there was a vibrant, how shall I put it, muscular Jewish state uh, outside of America made them feel more confident as Americans. And then there was just the enormous contribution that Jews were making in the universities, and and as teachers at every level. Teaching was the great profession um, for many, second generation. The New York public schools, I think, were quite good in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and there were largely Jewish teachers, or many Jewish teachers. I mean, I don't have figures so there were the recognition that this was a contribution, that it wasn't just the movies. It was very widespread. So a whole bunch of things came together.
I want to come back to something you said earlier that they were doing well, but they didn't want to tell anybody. They didn't want to
Right.
brag about it. Talk about what that was about.
It was fear. Don't boast. Don't awaken. Anti-Semitism is a foul underground stream that bursts above into open air every once in a while, and we're seeing it now. And it's a very complex issue now because it has to do with Israel, of course, and Gaza. But there are definitely elements now. Um, but it's it it seemed to lessen enormously um, in the late 40s and early 50s. You wanted Jews in your community. You saw them as no longer as pushy, strange outsiders, but as more middle class Americans. And many, of course, particularly the German Jewish strain, tried as hard as they could from the middle of the 19th century to assimilate. That my guys are all of Russian, Eastern European and Russian descent, and they carried with them a kind of exuberance, rebelliousness, a joy in life, a desire to misbehave. Not all of them, of course, but it was there. That strain was there, and it certainly comes out in Mailer, who rejected. He always said the one unacceptable version of himself was that of a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn. And it was unacceptable because that's what he was until he was in the army during World War II and in a very tough unit of Texans who had been through a lot. And it toughened him up enormously. But he was running away from what he took to be Yiddishkeit, the soft version of Yiddishkeit, and in some ways running towards it at the same time. My parents were very contemptuous of shickers, men who drank, and were not good family men. Mailer drank. My parents were very upset by violence. So, with memories of bully boys in Germany and Austria. Mailer butted heads at parties. By the way, in the 50s and 60s, there was the ideal in New York among intellectuals and artists of the perfectly dreadful party. You had to have one, a really bad party. And, and Mailer was master of that. Drunkenness, fights, quarrels. He was fascinated by spies, by criminals, and especially violent young men who were sort of instinctively outsiders in this, what he took to be conformist and spiritually dead 50s America, and hence the fascination with Lee Harvey Oswald, with Jack Henry Abbott, um, and with Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore was a lifetime con. He gets out and immediately kills two people senselessly. His family turns him in, and he demands to be. He's found guilty, and he demands to be executed by firing squad. Demands it, and all of liberal culture was trying to save him from execution, and he had this kind of incredible lucidity about his situation, and he was sticking it to them. Anyway, he was killed by firing squad. Mailer wasn't involved in this at all, but his friend Larry Schiller brought him in. And Mailer spent 8 months in South Central Utah, Provo, Orrin, around there, south of Salt Lake, interviewing everyone involved in the case. And he wrote this extraordinary book, which I think most people feel is his masterpiece, The Executioner's Song. And one of the things that's extraordinary is he had made himself a character in his narratives, like Armies of the Night, which is the book about the 60s. It's about a march on the Pentagon during the Vietnam War. And Mailer is a character in the book as well as the author. Mailer does this, Mailer does that. Very complicated literary strategy that freed him both to act and to observe himself acting. Anyway, he did a bunch of books with himself in the action. I think he was Aquarius in his book about the moon shot. Anyway, for um, this marvelous book, The Executioner's Song, on Gary Gilmore, he takes himself out altogether. It's 1,048 pages, very, very long, entirely in the voices of those people in South Central Utah. Gary's letters, Gary's interviews. Schiller had done interviews, his family, his girlfriend, the court people. He recreates an entire society that is very, very far from, Brooklyn, and takes himself out altogether. So, I mean, he wanted to get into the mind of someone who refused and take that wherever it goes. I mean, and this crazy story about Jack Henry Abbott, who was also a lifetime con who had killed two people, Mailer helps him get out of prison. He immediately kills someone. I mean, Norman couldn't deal with the fact that these guys who had been in prison their whole lives weren't fit to inhabit normal society. And he kept in touch with Jack Henry Abbott when he went back into prison and tried to get him off Marxism, Leninism by introducing him to the Talmud, the Jewish law. And Abbott becomes, in a couple of years, an expert and boasts that he knows a lot more about Judaism than his friends in New York. Anyway, he was obsessed with these guys and made literature out of it.
How did he square, and not just Mailer, but others as well? We can talk about Friedan and others. How did they square the work that they did, which was rebellious at the very least, as you just talked about with Mailer, for example, and at the same time not wanting to poke one's head and boast too much?
Well, I don't think they were afraid of these. These bunch were not afraid of boasting. I think I meant by that middle class Jews in general, business people in general, academics in general. These four, I think, were self promoters. Certainly, Betty, who hated flying, flew all over the country when The Feminine Mystique came out in 1963. Her very good book, still very much worth reading, summing up of of the case for women and how they had been relegated to secondhand status. Mel, of course, is a one-man band. I mean, and two things about it: he sells whatever project he's working on, and he sells himself as an American Jew, insists on it. He was on Johnny Carson, I think around 1980, and he was on Carson a lot, 19 times altogether. And he suddenly says, "This is an incredible fraud. This is one of the worst frauds ever perpetrated." Johnny tucks his chin and, "Really? I didn't know that. What do you mean?" I was born 5 feet 11 inches, blonde hair, a straight nose, and I went into Mount Sinai and they knocked the stuffings out of me. They took off 2 inches out of my legs. They redid my nose. They lowered my voice because I wanted to be a Jew comic. Now, notice he doesn't say a Jewish comic. This it's I don't know. I'd like to hear what you think. It's sort of a quirk of the language. Jewish is pretty much anodyne. It's just right descriptive, but Jew still has that power of a brand. Like if you were in a small town in 30s Midwest, you would be the Jew plumber or the Jew carpenter. It was a brand, and he insisted on it, Mel. And the word Jew would pop out of him, like candies from a gumball machine all the
Was
time.
he ever concerned that it would have a negative impact or that it would create some kind of backlash?
I think he just blasted through it. I mean, he was by the age of 14, he was up in the Catskills. Um, he was a pool tumbler. A tumbler is the guy who is meant to entertain all the time, anywhere. Like you might be on the lawn outside the dining room or in the dining room. Mel's job was to in the sleepy hours between lunch and dinner to entertain the ladies mainly because the men were off playing cards. So he would entertain them, and they would say, "Mel, you're terrible, but we love you." But I think he got a kind of unshakable confidence out of that. I've talked to him maybe 5 6 times, and I said, you're very precise. You don't waste any words. And he said, listen, when you were in the Catskills, they would throw you out there. You got 3 minutes, kid. You couldn't fool around. You had to know exactly what you were doing. But he also said to me on another occasion, you can tell an amateur comic by the way they run to the end, right? They run to the punchline. He grew up listening to Eddie Cantor on the radio in the 30s and Fred Allen and other great radio performers. He said, notice that they don't they pause, they go off the beat. That's what confidence takes. So on one hand, great concision. On the other hand, timing, such that you have to pause now and then to make it into music. All great comedy is music. So I mean, no, he was not afraid of a negative reaction because he was the Jew comic, and I mean, he'd come on to Johnny Carson, um, cross the front of the stage, and then just keep on going out the other side of the stage until someone retrieved him. He'd pick up Ed McMahon's coffee cup and spit it out, and say, "What on the air? This is what you drink." I mean, he was positioned himself as outrageous and intelligent at the same time. And the other great one, of course, on Johnny Carson was Robin Williams. But Robin Williams was nuts. I mean, he would just fling himself around, corkscrew himself, rush from one accent to another. He was a genius. But you look at Mel, and he seems like an extremely intelligent guy who uses every part of his body. His determination was to defeat death. His father died when he was 2. He never knew his father. He's working there after the Holocaust, and he keeps reviving the Jew killers like Hitler and Springtime for Hitler. the Nazi music number, and then even more outrageously, the Inquisition in History of the World Part One, 1981. I have embarrassed to say I panned that movie in New York Magazine when it came out, and I now think that it's brilliant, and that the Inquisition scene in particular, in which Mel is in a cassock and has dancing monks all around him and a musical number that he wrote, while Jews are strung up on the walls in various states of misery, and then nuns appear and take off their habits, and they have beautiful, Esther Williams white bathing suits underneath, and they drag the Jews down into the water. It is the most, humiliating picture of Jewish abjectness, and it outraged a lot of people, including me. And now I see what he's been doing here is saying, "You're alive. Get over it." I don't know if he'd say that after October 7th. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was certainly saying it then, and he finally admitted it. I mean, I pressed him on it. I mean, great American entertainers don't like to make large claims for themselves. John Ford, great director, movie director, showed up at some meeting in I think 1948, and he said, "I'm John Ford. I make westerns." That's it. you know, and Mel doesn't like to make claims for himself, and I had to push him hard to the point where it irritated him. But he did finally say, "Yes, get over it." I mean, by staging these atrocious events as comedies, he's pushing Jews to drop self pity and to enjoy the fact that they are alive. That's my interpretation, anyway. I take him more seriously than other people do. He was obsessed with death his whole life, as I said before. Well, I hope without destroying the fun at the same time.
The other impact that he had is that he had a tremendous influence on other Jewish comics that came along around the same time.
Yeah, yes, and I say he liberated the Jewish body. You know, that reticence about body functions and sex itself, that my parents and that generation that grew up with and believed in. He just exploded all of that, the body and all of its lusts and fevers and ejections, and I'm running out of words here, but you know what I mean. He celebrated all of that over and over again. And Mailer too, by the way. I mean, the sexual reticence of his parents' generation was something he hated, and there are good and bad sides to this. I mean, he was married 6 times, and he cheated on all 6 of them. Um, of course, and committed a terrible act, stabbing his second wife, Adele Morales, in a drunken party. I talked about bad parties. This was the worst. For the record, she lived till 90 and wrote a book about the whole thing. He also was very explicit, about words and about body functions, and he had the greatest nose in the history of literature. The olfactory, is that the right word? Function as smells fascinated him. Bad smells, good smells. He wanted to bring the body back into consciousness, which he felt, I think, had been suppressed by Jews in many ways.
And in many ways, that was the case not only with Mel, but with Mailer, as you're saying, and with Leonard Bernstein, and certainly with Betty Friedan as well, that sense of physical liberation was very much a part of all of this.
Absolutely. I mean, Betty Friedan, I don't know how else to say it, liked sex with men. She really did. And it was women she had trouble with, the great feminist. She had to dominate every meeting. I mean, she's a plain girl from Peoria, Illinois, an anti Semitic town, 100 miles southwest of Chicago. Henry Ford and his Dearborn Independent, an anti Semitic rag, is all, not very far away. Anyway, and she's a star in school, public school, which had surprisingly strong education, maybe not surprising. Mathematics, Latin. It was very good, very severe, but she didn't get into the sorority, which you could say, so what? For her, it was a big deal. She goes on to Smith with it. She's a student leader, eventually gets to New York, not sure what she wants to write, writes for union papers. Some people have misinterpreted her as a leftist, and she's certainly a liberal, but she was very much a bourgeoise, as she tells you over and over again in her autobiography. Anyway, to be attractive to men was extremely important to her. To have children was extremely important to her. And in the late 60s, I mean, her great book comes out in 63, and she's a very famous woman. She sells 1.3 million copies in paperback the year after the hardcover. Um, and she then loses control of the movement. First of all, she didn't seem to notice it didn't need a central control anymore. It was breaking out all over the place, consciousness raising and feminist publications of all sorts and medical stuff. She thought it should have a central control, and she was intolerant of lesbians, an extraordinary uh, theme running through her whole adult life until she finally gave that up. Marriage was extremely important to her, and she thought, in particular, feminists should marry and have children. That, of course, was the problem. How do you do that and also work? It's the problem we still haven't solved in this country very well. But that insistence on marriage and childhood, I think, separated her from the younger, more radical elements of the women's movement in the late 60s, and her obvious loathing of lesbians. I mean, which was just politically stupid since they were an important part of the constituency for the women's movement, and she lost control of it and sort of wandered the last 30 years of her life. I mean, she wrote a great deal, and she literally wandered. She went all over the world talking as a feminist. But yes, life in the body was essential for Jewish women. That was part of what she insisted on. So, and Lenny, of course, was all body. I mean, everything he thought he could act out as he was conducting. Everything he felt. There was no distinction for him between an idea and the physical expression of the idea. That is what drove people crazy in the late 50s and early 60s. There was definitely a sensual element to his conducting. Classical ecstasies should be clean, for God's sakes. And the German Jews, who were music reviewers like Harold Schoenberg, turned on him with a vehemence that seems to me very suspicious. I think it was very threatening. And finally, when first time he went to Vienna in 1966, 6 years before the problems with Mahler with the Vienna Philharmonic, he was a tremendous success. And an odd thing happened. Two things happened. They wouldn't stop applauding. And he certainly liked applause. And he wrote his parents home and said, something strange going on here. I seem to have replaced Von Karajan, great conductor, as the local hero. Suddenly it's fashionable to be Jewish. And he was the conquering American who was liberating, in a sense, Vienna from its cultural prejudices. The other thing was when he came home, and the emotionalism of his conducting, the physical explicitness of it, which enchanted the Viennese. Suddenly, at home, Schoenberg and others said, well, he's gained a new maturity. So here's the comedy. The American who was a ham bone, who was Broadway, who was not worthy of the classical tradition, goes to the center of classical tradition, receives acclaim, comes home, and suddenly it's the new maturity. Except for the prigs, I think everyone realized that all of that body movement, which is beautiful to watch, by the way, was not for show. It was all very instrumental. I mean, he subdivided the beat for greater clarity. He cued in the solos. He acted that. He was a teacher, Leonard Bernstein, for all his physical ecstasies. He was a teacher always. That's a Jewish element. And he taught on the podium. He taught on television. He taught in bed with whomever he was in bed with. He could not stop himself. Right to the very end of his life, he was trying to set up a music festival in Japan. The movements are, if you look at them now without any of this fear of what it looks like, that all seems very instrumental in getting and you can hear this. He's getting the sounds he wants. There are a lot of films of him conducting the Vienna Philharmonic, Beethoven, Mahler, Brahms, Sibelius, Shostakovich. It's very easy to see.
Certainly, there were many others that were part of this era. You have focused on these four, and there were others like Philip Roth and Bob Dylan and many others. Talk about the way in which this era started to fade away and how you see that from the vantage point of today.
That's something I haven't really worked out. I mean, with Philip Roth and Dylan, it was just a generational thing. I mean, that could be another book, the people born in the 30s. And Dylan was born at what, 41, 42. So I was determined to keep it born after the First World War, emerged after the Second World War by means of their own gifts and by means of new media, television, the long playing record, mass travel, the paperback original. Um, I don't think it's faded as much as people say. I mean, there are some young Jewish comics. There are endless Jewish musicians, Jewish tech, guys. I mean, it's if you want to be literal about it, the Jews are no longer top dog in terms of ethnic income. It's the Asians, but it's the Asians come from all over. From I mean, it's just a grab bag of people from India, from Indonesia, from Vietnam, from Japan, from China, and they're often highly trained technically when they get here. But the Jewish contribution is still way out of proportion to its numbers. We are 2.3% of the population, 7 million or so. It's a little hard to count. American Jews out of 330 or so Americans. 0.02 of the world's population, 18 million, out of 8 billion world population. We are a tiny minority. And I think we have to make noise. This is a very difficult period for all of us. And if I might just editorialize for 1 second, anyone who thinks that Donald Trump loves the Jews and that the reason he's pushing the universities around is because he's trying to protect the Jews is very naive. The Trump administration is using anti-Semitism on campus, which does exist, not to the extraordinary degree that they're pretending it exists, but it's certainly there. They're using that as a pretext to bring liberal culture to its knees. I'm choosing my words very carefully. It's going to be the arts next, National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEA, that local dance company that is the pride of your community, the library that has a wonderful collection, so many other arts institutions are going to collapse. They're going to disappear. They are killing any area of the country, the Trump administration, that can provide a kind of independent sensibility, if they can get away with it. Everything should be about earning money, and every element of life has to be productive. They don't understand that that the United States government it can't be run as a business. It's not a business. It's quite different. If you have a business with an unproductive wing, yes, you can lop it off. You can't do that to a government. You're hurting too many people. Anyway, I'm sorry. Enough editorializing. But
That's okay, but let's stay on that for a minute. And this
okay.
slightly off the topic of eminent Jews, but why haven't we seen more pushback from people in the arts? Why has this been a time when the arts have not led the way in terms of protest?
Well, I think it takes a while. You remember in the 60s, there was a lot of, there were plays as well as all of the demonstrations against the war. There was, McBird, right? And a lot of off-Broadway theater and comedy sketch groups. It takes a while. The shock of how much, I mean, we're still only, what, 85 days into this administration? I mean, everyone is sort of stunned. And I think Columbia is beginning to find Columbia University. I mean, thanks to Harvard being aggressively fighting Trump, Columbia now in its wake is beginning to toughen up. The Big Ten universities, plus Rutgers, are toughening up, and and so on. They have to act together and work together. But you're right. There's been a lag in the. I mean, Saturday Night Live has been making fun of Trump pretty regularly, and that's the fastest response. I mean, something can happen on Thursday, and they'll have the cold opening on Saturday. But there needs to be a lot more. I mean, there's been a hell of a lot of journalism, of course, but even journalism, I feel about the people at the Times that they are so much at the center of national coverage, what should and what should not be, that they're having trouble taking in that we are in the middle of a right-wing revolution and that almost everything could change if it's not prevented. It's a little hard for them. And my own publication, and the New Yorker too, is holding to its style and to its graciousness. It hasn't always been adequate to this crisis, except the editor, David Remnick, who's written very well about it. But many of the others, it's not quite taken in yet. I
Well,
mean, it happened very suddenly.
and you touched on that a moment ago. It transcends the political aspect of this, and what we're seeing is, or certainly we're at an early stage of, maybe even a little later, of a cultural revolution.
Absolutely, absolutely, like Mao's Cultural Revolution. Although I don't think the professors are going to be sent to work on the farms in Iowa, but they're going to be diminished unless Harvard and the other universities overcome this. They're going to be diminished in many ways until the universities start hiring, right wing or at least conservative researchers and thinkers. It's a cultural revolution that I hope will fail. I mean, and I had problems with DEI and excessive wokeness myself because I think it attacks intellectual standards. But the purpose of it also, the purpose of liberalism in general is to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. And in particular, as far as DEI goes, I think the unstated purpose was to enlarge the black middle class. Anecdotally, I think black women are doing rather well, and black men, the urban culture of hip hop of the last 40 years is brilliant and funny and violent and sexy and all those great things, but it's not particularly productive of a work ethos. And anyway, so I think DEI was to help people get into the system. They were not going to be put in charge of $150 million research grants, at New York Presbyterian Hospital, but they were getting jobs, significant jobs in which they could build middle class families, under the assumption that in this country the most successful individuals generally come out of the middle class. That I thought was a worthy intention. How it was done in each individual place, I don't know, and I'm sure that there were bad things as well as good. But to denigrate it completely and obsessively and throw it out altogether seems like a crime to me.
David Denby, his book is Eminent Jews. David, I thank you so very much for spending time with us.
It was great, and thank you for letting me spout.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.